The professor thought she had the upper hand, until Barron Trump stood up. When an elite liberal professor tried to humiliate Barron Trump in front of an entire class, she had no idea she was challenging a math genius with a 170 IQ. What happened next left the entire lecture hall in stunned silence. But the real shock? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The heavy oak doors of the lecture hall groaned as students filtered in, their chatter a low hum beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. It was an ordinary morning, except it wasn't. A strange tension hung in the air, subtle yet undeniable. The usual pre-class rustling of notebooks and the tapping of pens against desks felt muted, almost restrained, as if some unspoken storm was about to break. At the center of it all stood Dr. Linda Markham, a towering figure of academic prestige, her reputation as an expert in advanced calculus only rivaled by her sharp political leanings. For years, she had commanded this classroom with an iron grip, known just as much for her mathematical brilliance as for her not-so-subtle attempts to weave ideological lessons into her curriculum. She had mastered the art of the condescending smirk, of the passive-aggressive remark that would leave students doubting themselves, questioning if they had just been insulted or enlightened. Today, however, was different. Something had shifted. The massive whiteboard at the front of the room, usually filled with elegant equations or complex theorems, instead displayed a single phrase, written in bold, aggressive strokes. Today's topic: redefining academic priorities. A few students exchanged glances. Some sighed in frustration, while others leaned forward in anticipation, knowing exactly what was about to happen. They had seen this pattern before. A class supposedly about calculus would soon morph into a lecture on privilege, systemic oppression, and why math itself needed to be deconstructed in favor of more relevant discussions. In the back row, sitting quietly, was Barron Trump. He was hard to miss. Tall, composed, and effortlessly poised in a crisp black suit that seemed at odds with the casual attire of his peers. He had been in Dr. Markham's class for weeks, yet he had barely spoken. He was the type to observe first, to study the dynamics of the room before engaging. Unlike most students, he didn't squirm under Dr. Markham's sharp gaze. Instead, he watched her with a quiet intensity, an unreadable expression that gave nothing away. Dr. Markham strode across the front of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Her eyes scanned the class, landing briefly on Barron before moving on. A calculated move, but not a dismissive one. She knew exactly who he was. Mathematics, she began, her voice smooth yet laced with authority, is a valuable field. But in today's world, we must ask ourselves, what are we prioritizing? A few students shifted in their seats. Others sat motionless, waiting. The way we teach math, she continued, her tone sharpening, has long been built on elitist and exclusionary principles, and today, I want us to reflect on how we can make this subject more inclusive, more relevant to real-world applications. She turned back to the whiteboard, clicking a PowerPoint remote. The next slide did not display a mathematical equation. Instead, a chart appeared, one showing disparities in STEM fields based on race and gender. Several students exchanged wary glances. Some nodded in agreement with the professor's implication. Others, particularly those who had come to this class expecting, well, calculus, felt frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Still, Barron remained unmoving, watching, waiting. Dr. Markham's gaze flickered briefly to him again. A calculated move, a challenge. Some of you, she continued, her voice casual but dripping with implied meaning, might be under the impression that math is purely objective, purely about merit. But the reality is, not everyone arrives in this class on an equal playing field. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. A long, weighted silence stretched across the space. Then, a movement. Barron raised his hand. It was slow, deliberate, a simple act, yet it sent shockwaves through the room. Students turned, eyes widening, Barron Trump never spoke in class, never interrupted, never challenged. Until now. Dr. Markham's eyebrows twitched, her lips curving into what almost resembled a smirk. She had anticipated pushback today, perhaps even hoped for it, but she had not expected it from him. "Yes, Mr. Trump." Her voice was smooth, but her eyes were sharp, glinting like steel. Barron's expression remained impassive, but there was a spark of something unreadable in his gaze. "Professor," he said, his voice calm, measured, but commanding in its own right, "I understand that you're making a larger societal point, but doesn't reducing emphasis on academic rigor in favor of ideological discussions ultimately disadvantage all students?" A pin-drop silence. A few students leaned forward, intrigued. Others held their breath, watching. Dr. Markham's smile did not fade, but her eyes darkened. "Interesting perspective," she said slowly, "though I suppose some students are more accustomed than others to benefiting from advantages in education." The room felt colder. For a moment it was unclear what Barron would say, if he would take the bait, become defensive, or even back down. Instead, he smiled. And that's when everything changed. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every student sat motionless, some glancing between Dr. Markham and Barron Trump, others gripping the edges of their desks as if bracing for impact. Barron's smile was calm, almost amused, but there was a quiet power behind it, a knowing confidence that only made Dr. Markham's smirk tighten. She had spent years in academia, honing her craft, delivering subtle yet deliberate blows to students who dared to challenge her authority. But something about Barron's composure unsettled her. "I see," she said finally, tilting her head slightly. "You believe that maintaining high academic standards benefits all students?" "Yes," Barron replied, his voice steady, as if he had already anticipated this move. "Mathematics, at its core, is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about political ideologies, privilege, or wealth. A correct answer is a correct answer, no matter who solves the problem." A murmur rippled through the room. A few students nodded subtly in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for Dr. Markham's counterattack. "Fascinating," she mused, pacing slightly. "You argue that math is neutral, that it exists in a vacuum. But let's consider something." She clicked the remote in her hand. The projector screen flashed, displaying another slide. A bold, inflammatory statistic about wealth disparities in education. "Some students," she continued, her voice silky, laced with condescension, "are simply handed opportunities others must fight for. Wouldn't you say, Mr. Trump, that your very presence in this class is a direct result of advantages others never had?" The air grew heavier. Barron's expression did not falter, not even a flicker of discomfort. "I won't argue that I've been fortunate," he replied, his tone composed. "But I also won't apologize for working hard to achieve academic excellence. You assume privilege guarantees success, but success is earned, not inherited." Dr. Markham's lips pressed into a thin line. "Oh?" she challenged, her tone sharpening. "Then tell me, Mr. Trump, would you say your last name had nothing to do with where you are today?" A few students inhaled sharply, sensing the conversation had turned personal. Some of them had already noticed that Dr. Markham's critiques seemed more pointed whenever she addressed Barron directly. Barron exhaled softly, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk, as if calculating his next move. "My last name," he said, "is a fact. But it does not take my exams. It does not solve complex integrals. And it certainly will not help me with the challenge I am about to accept." Dr. Markham's smug expression faltered slightly. Barron leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "You believe that math is not just about numbers," he continued. "You believe that a student's background should factor into their learning experience. So let's test that, right here, right now." A shift, a turning point. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Trump?" "A challenge," Barron said simply. "A problem. You create the equation. I solve it. Let's see whether privilege has anything to do with mathematics." The room exploded into whispers. A few students turned to each other, whispering incredulously, while others simply stared in stunned silence. Dr. Markham's eyes flickered, as if she hadn't expected this direct confrontation. But then, ever so slowly, a smile curved her lips again. This time, sharper, more dangerous. "Very well," she said, striding toward the whiteboard. "If you want a test, Mr. Trump, I'll give you one." The marker squeaked against the board as she began scrawling a massive equation, its symbols sprawling in long, intricate patterns. The further she wrote, the more complex it became. An advanced multivariable calculus problem, the kind even seasoned scholars would hesitate to tackle. Students watched in awe, their expressions ranging from concern to fascination. Dr. Markham stepped back, admiring her work with a self-satisfied smirk. "There," she said, "if you want to prove that math is the great equalizer, then show us. Solve it." She extended the marker toward Barron, fully expecting hesitation, doubt, even fear. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Barron Trump stood without hesitation, his movements graceful, unrushed. As he took the marker from her outstretched hand, he smiled again. This time, with the confidence of someone who already knew exactly how this was going to end. A hush fell over the room. The marker felt light in Barron's hand as he stood before the whiteboard, the daunting equation towering over him. The audience of students sat on the edge of their seats, their eyes darting between Dr. Markham's smug expression and Barron's poised demeanor. Dr. Markham folded her arms, watching him with an expression that barely concealed her amusement. She thought she had him. The problem she had scrawled across the board wasn't just difficult, it was maliciously designed, a trap. It incorporated multiple layers of advanced calculus, including complex integration, non-trivial substitutions, and a hidden singularity that would send any unprepared solver spiraling into mathematical chaos. But Barron wasn't unprepared. He studied the equation for a brief moment, his eyes scanning the intricate mess of symbols. His grip tightened slightly around the marker. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the overhead projectors. And then, he smiled. "You made an interesting choice, Professor," he said lightly, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. Dr. Markham's eyebrow twitched. "Oh," she said, feigning boredom. "Yes," Barron mused, tapping the marker against the board, "because, at first glance, this looks unsolvable." A few students inhaled sharply. "But," he continued, stepping forward, "only if you don't see the pattern hidden within it." And then he began writing. The moment the marker touched the board, everything changed. His movements were precise, fluid, almost effortless. Instead of following the obvious, painful brute force method that most would struggle with, Barron rewrote the equation entirely, simplifying it with a substitution so elegant, so efficient, that even the brightest students in the room struggled to keep up. He spoke calmly as he worked. "This integral here," he gestured, "is a red herring. If you approach it directly, you end up with an impossible loop. But," he circled a term, "if we apply a differential transformation using Euler's theorem, the whole thing collapses into a solvable form." A murmur rippled through the classroom. Even students who didn't fully grasp the math could see what was happening. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was unraveling it like an intricate puzzle, exposing each hidden flaw in Dr. Markham's attempted trap. Dr. Markham's smirk faded. Barron continued, his voice smooth and composed. "This part," he pointed, "is interesting because at first glance it seems necessary to use numerical approximations. But actually, if we recall the work of Leibniz and his original derivation in 1673, we can use a generalized series approach." He paused for a second, glancing over his shoulder at Dr. Markham. "Would you prefer I continue with that, or would you rather I solve it using your method?" The room was dead silent. Dr. Markham said nothing. A few students began filming on their phones, realizing they were witnessing something incredible. Barron turned back to the board, unfazed by her lack of response. He continued his work with an almost effortless grace, every movement deliberate, every stroke of the marker executed with perfect precision. He bypassed every trap, every misleading term, every roadblock that had been carefully placed in his way. The once monstrous equation shrunk under his hand, condensing into a clean, concise solution. He took a step back, allowing everyone to absorb what they had just witnessed. And then, with one final stroke of his marker, he boxed the answer. "Done," he said, capping the marker and placing it gently on the ledge of the whiteboard. A beat of silence. Then, chaos. The classroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, stunned whispers. A few students actually stood up from their seats, craning their necks to get a better view. Some looked between each other in disbelief while others sat frozen, their jaws practically on the floor. Even those who didn't fully grasp the advanced calculus knew what they had just seen. A genius at work. But the most striking reaction came from Dr. Markham herself. Her face had drained of color. Her arms had fallen to her sides. She stared at the board, at the flawless solution, as if unable to comprehend how her carefully laid trap had just collapsed around her. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her fingers twitched slightly, a subconscious movement, a telltale sign of someone who had just suffered a catastrophic intellectual defeat. The problem she had chosen was meant to humiliate Barron Trump. Instead, he had used it to showcase a level of mastery that she had never anticipated. Barron turned casually to face her. "Would you like me to go over any of the steps?" he asked politely, his tone free of arrogance. A few students stifled nervous laughter. Dr. Markham's jaw tensed, but she said nothing. She had nothing left to say. The silence that followed Barron's solution was almost unnatural. For a moment, it was as if the entire room had been frozen in time. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even breathed. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead, and then the weight of what had just happened crashed down on the room. Students whispered to each other in shock, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Phones that had been lifted discreetly during the exchange now captured every detail of the scene unfolding before them. Dr. Markham still hadn't moved. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk, white-knuckled, her eyes locked on the board, as if staring at the ruins of a battle she had just lost. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned back to Barron. "Well," she said, forcing a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "it seems you've done your homework, Mr. Trump." A few students snickered quietly, sensing her frustration. But Barron, as always, remained composed. "I enjoy studying the work of great mathematicians," he said, his tone even and polite. "When you love something, you want to understand it deeply." That statement, so simple, so pure in its intent, cut through the room like a blade. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about truth, learning, knowledge. And that's what made the moment so much more devastating for Dr. Markham, because she realized right then and there that she had made a critical mistake. She had assumed that Barron Trump was nothing more than a privileged student with a famous last name. But now, faced with undeniable evidence of his intelligence, his dedication, his pure love for the subject, she understood that she had been entirely, catastrophically wrong. And worse than that, so did everyone else in the room. The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Markham's usual confidence, that air of smug superiority she carried in every lecture, was slipping. She knew she had to do something, anything, to regain control. She cleared her throat and gestured vaguely toward the board. "Well, that was certainly unexpected." A few students raised their eyebrows. "But," she continued, trying to sound unaffected, "this isn't a math competition. It's about broader education, and I believe we were discussing the role of privilege in academia." Barron studied her for a moment. It was obvious what she was doing. She couldn't fight him on the math, so she was trying to change the rules of the game, shift the focus, make it about something else. But he didn't take the bait. Instead, he folded his arms and spoke with quiet confidence. "Education should be about merit," he said. "Hard work, dedication, effort. When we focus more on identity than on ability, we aren't helping students, we're hurting them. The words landed like a bomb. A ripple of murmurs ran through the students. Barron turned slightly, gesturing toward his classmates. There are students here, right now, who study for hours every night just to keep up, who come from all different backgrounds, different struggles. But what brings us together is that we're all here to learn, to challenge ourselves, to grow. The students nodded, some whispering in agreement. Barron continued, his voice steady, unwavering. Mathematics doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about who your parents are or where you come from. It's about truth, logic, precision. And when we start pushing social narratives over real knowledge, we do a disservice to every student in this room. The room erupted into scattered applause. Dr. Markham's face darkened. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the class to side with him. She had assumed she had control of the narrative, that she could humiliate Barron in front of his peers, make an example out of him. Instead, the exact opposite had happened. She forced another smile, but it was clear she was losing ground. Well, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice overly sweet, it's interesting that you say that, but isn't it true that your privilege, your last name, gives you access to tutors, to resources, to opportunities that others don't have? Barron tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, and then he dropped a bombshell. My father never hired me a math tutor. The class fell into stunned silence. Dr. Markham blinked. Excuse me? I never had a math tutor, Barron repeated. I studied on my own, read books, practiced problems, taught myself through trial and error. Everything I know I learned because I wanted to learn it. Dr. Markham opened her mouth, then closed it. Her entire argument had just been obliterated. Barron wasn't just brilliant, he had earned it. And now everyone in that room knew it. The silence in the lecture hall was suffocating. Dr. Markham's carefully curated facade of authority was crumbling by the second, and she knew it. She forced a smile, trying to mask her frustration, but it was clear to everyone watching she was trapped. Barron Trump had just delivered a devastating truth bomb. He had never been handed success. His brilliance wasn't a product of privilege, it was earned. Through relentless study, through his own dedication, through an insatiable hunger for knowledge. And now everyone in that room knew it. Dr. Markham was running out of options. She couldn't dismiss Barron as some entitled rich kid, not when he had just demonstrated a mathematical mastery far beyond anything she had expected. She couldn't claim he was coasting on his last name, not when he had just humiliated her in front of the entire class on her own turf. And she certainly couldn't attack his intelligence, because it was now undeniable. So she did the only thing left. She made it personal. Well, she said, clearing her throat as she tried to regain control, perhaps that explains your attitude, Mr. Trump. Barron's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something sharp crossed his eyes. My attitude? He asked, his voice still polite, but carrying an edge that made the room go still. Dr. Markham leaned forward, as if preparing for her final attack. You sit in the back of the class, hardly say a word, never engage in social discussions, she said, her voice laced with fake concern. Do you think you're too good for your fellow students? A few students shifted in their seats, sensing the thinly veiled insult behind the question. Barron remained calm, his eyes locked on the professor, like a chess player waiting for his opponent to make a fatal mistake. I sit in the back, he said slowly, because I prefer to listen. Dr. Markham's lips pressed into a tight line, but Barron wasn't finished. I don't speak unless I have something worth saying, he continued. Perhaps if more people listened before speaking, we'd have better discussions in this class. The room erupted into quiet laughter. Dr. Markham's face flushed. Her grip on power, on control, was slipping further, and Barron had just tightened the noose. But she still refused to back down. Is that so? She shot back. And do you think you have something worth saying now? Barron tilted his head slightly, studying her. Do you? He asked. The room went dead silent. It was a direct challenge, and Dr. Markham knew it. A few students whispered to each other, some stifling smirks, others watching in pure shock. Nobody had ever spoken to Dr. Markham like this, but nobody had ever exposed her like this either. She straightened her shoulders, doing her best to maintain her crumbling authority. "This class is about more than just numbers, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice tight and clipped. "It's about understanding the bigger picture, how the world works, who benefits from certain structures, who gets left behind." Barron didn't blink. "That's interesting," he said, his voice steady, "because I thought this was an advanced calculus class." The room exploded. Laughter. Applause. A few students even clapped their hands against their desks, nodding in agreement. Dr. Markham's jaw tightened. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to paint Barron as an out-of-touch elitist, but he had flipped the script effortlessly, exposing her own hypocrisy in the process. And worst of all, he had done it without raising his voice, without an ounce of arrogance, and without a single personal attack. It was a masterclass in composure. Dr. Markham's fingers curled around her lecture notes, gripping them so tightly that the pages crumpled. She was losing, and she knew it. But before she could say another word, something unexpected happened. A voice from the middle of the room spoke up. "I have a question." All eyes turned to Michael Chen, a quiet student who rarely spoke. Dr. Markham, grateful for any distraction, turned to him with a forced smile. "Yes, Michael," she said. Michael glanced at Barron, then at the board, then back at the professor. "I don't mean to interrupt," he said hesitantly, "but could Barron explain that last step again, the one about using Leibniz's method?" For the first time all class, Dr. Markham was speechless, because suddenly this wasn't just an argument anymore. This wasn't just about her trying to humiliate Barron. This was about the students. And right now, they weren't looking to her for answers. They were looking to Barron. Slowly, he nodded. "Of course," he said. He picked up the marker again, turned to the board, and began explaining the concept in clear, precise terms. And as he spoke, something incredible happened. More hands went up. More students asked questions. More students engaged. And for the first time all semester, the lecture hall felt alive with curiosity and learning. Dr. Markham stood frozen, watching it all unfold. And in that moment, she realized the truth. She had never been in control, because true leadership doesn't come from demanding authority. It comes from earning respect. And right now, in front of everyone, Barron Trump had just earned theirs. For the first time in the entire class, Dr. Linda Markham had lost control. She had spent the semester commanding the room, dictating the discussion, shifting the focus away from actual calculus and toward her own ideological agenda. She was the authority. She set the rules. But now, the entire class had turned away from her. Barron Trump was standing at the front of the room, marker in hand, explaining an advanced calculus concept with a level of clarity and depth that had captivated every single student in the hall. Hands were going up, not with objections, but with genuine curiosity. Students were leaning forward, engaged, not in some forced political discussion, but in the actual material they had signed up to learn. And Dr. Markham hated it. She watched as Barron continued, his voice steady, his movements precise. He wasn't just solving the problem anymore. He was teaching it. And worst of all, he was doing it better than she ever had. She saw it in the students' faces, the realization, the quiet understanding dawning in their expressions. For months, they had endured her lectures, sitting through her long-winded monologues about privilege, power structures, and academic priorities. But now they were learning. Now they were seeing what real education looked like. And it had nothing to do with politics. Dr. Markham's nails dug into the palm of her hand. She couldn't let this continue. Taking a deep breath, she forced a smile, straightened her shoulders, and did what any wounded academic with a fragile ego would do. She interrupted. "Well," she said, her voice cutting sharply through the lecture hall, "I suppose we should be grateful for our guest instructor's spontaneous contribution." Barron paused, turning his head slightly toward her. The students stiffened, sensing what was coming. Dr. Markham stepped forward, reclaiming her space at the front of the room. "But since you seem so eager to impress us, Mr. Trump," she continued, her voice laced with condescension, "let's see if you can handle something truly challenging." A murmur rippled through the class. She strode to the whiteboard and with a flourish began writing. This wasn't just any equation. This was a problem designed to break him. An impossible, unsolvable problem. One that had confounded even graduate-level students for decades. It was her last chance to put Barron Trump in his place. She finished writing, capped her marker with a smug snap, and turned to him. "Since you're so passionate about mathematics," she said, crossing her arms, "solve this." A few students exchanged worried glances. Some whispered to each other, their voices uncertain. But Barron? He just stared at the board. Dr. Markham felt a rush of satisfaction. Finally, she thought. Finally, she had cornered him. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Then, Barron stepped forward, and he laughed. Not mockingly, not arrogantly, just a soft, amused chuckle. Dr. Markham's brow furrowed. "What's so funny?" she snapped. Barron turned to her, a calm, unreadable expression on his face. "This problem," he said simply. Dr. Markham's lips pressed together. "Well," she demanded, "do you have an answer, or would you like to finally admit that some things are beyond you?" Barron didn't hesitate. "Oh, I have an answer," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "But first I should let you know, this equation doesn't actually have a solution." The room froze. Dr. Markham's expression darkened. "What?" she said, her voice tightening. Barron gestured toward the equation. "This problem," he said, "is a well-known paradox. It was first introduced by Henri Poincaré in an attempt to challenge early assumptions about differential equations." He turned back to the board, grabbing the marker effortlessly. "The reason it's impossible to solve is that it assumes a set of conditions that contradict each other," he continued. "Mathematically, this system collapses before it can even begin." He turned to face Dr. Markham directly. "You already knew that." Dr. Markham's breath caught in her throat. The students were staring at her now. The realization was setting in. She hadn't just challenged Barron. She had tried to trick him, and she had failed. Barron tilted his head slightly, studying her. "If the goal was to test my knowledge, I appreciate the challenge," he said. He set the marker down on the ledge. "But if the goal was something else," he added, his voice quieter now, "then maybe we should ask ourselves why we're really here." Dr. Markham's face was a mask of rage. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, someone started clapping. One student, then another, until the entire class was on their feet. Barron stood still, silent, as the applause roared around him. And Dr. Markham? She just stood there, her arms locked at her sides, her face drained of color. She had lost. Not just the argument, not just the debate, but the respect of her students. And she knew it. Dr. Markham stood frozen, her face pale as the reality of the moment settled in. The applause wasn't just for Barron Trump's mathematical genius. It was for the truth he had exposed. The truth that had been buried beneath layers of condescending lectures and politically motivated distractions. She had prided herself on being the intellectual superior in the room, the gatekeeper of knowledge, the authority who determined what students should think, learn, and believe. But now, the very students she had sought to manipulate had turned against her. Barron remained still, his hands resting lightly at his sides as the applause continued, a quiet storm standing in the eye of the hurricane. And then, something even more unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the room, hesitant at first, spoke up. "I actually have a question about the problem," came a voice from a student named Sarah Chen, one of the few who had dared to challenge Dr. Markham in the past. She adjusted her glasses, looking at Barron with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Would you mind explaining how you recognized it was a paradox so quickly?" Barron smiled gently. "Of course," he said, as if none of the chaos had just occurred. He turned back to the board, completely at ease, as if he wasn't standing in the aftermath of a public academic takedown. And then the most surreal moment of all happened. Another hand went up, and then another, and another. Suddenly, the class was no longer focused on Dr. Markham's humiliation or the political games that had infected their learning environment. They were focused on learning. Real learning. For the first time in months, maybe years, the students in that room were genuinely excited to talk about calculus. And Dr. Markham was no longer part of the discussion. She watched, her lips pressed into a thin line, as Barron effortlessly answered question after question, his passion for mathematics contagious. He wasn't just rattling off formulas, he was teaching. And unlike her, he wasn't using his position to push an ideology, he was using it to inspire. More students leaned forward, some even pulling out their notebooks for the first time in weeks. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was her classroom, her authority. And yet, she had lost all control. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her attempts to publicly humiliate Barron had backfired so spectacularly that he had taken over the room. And no one, not even her loyal students, seemed to care. Her breathing quickened. This was a disaster. She had to do something. A forced, hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Well, Mr. Trump, since you've decided to take over my lecture, perhaps you'd like to take my job as well." The sarcasm dripped from her words, but it landed flat. Barron, ever composed, turned toward her and gave a small, polite smile. "Professor, I would never want to take your job," he said smoothly, "but I do hope we can all agree that a mathematics class should focus on mathematics." There it was, the final blow. The students erupted into applause again, louder this time, no hesitation, no divided loyalties. Dr. Markham felt the walls closing in. She had spent years building her image, carefully curating a reputation as an academic warrior for her ideological cause. And now, a single 18-year-old student had dismantled it all in the span of an hour. Not through insults, not through outrage, but through pure, undeniable brilliance. Her hands clenched at her sides. This wasn't over. Not yet. But before she could say another word, the door burst open, and in walked Dean Richardson. The room fell silent. Dean Richardson was no ally of Barron Trump. He was a longtime supporter of Dr. Markham's academic philosophy and had personally championed many of her progressive curriculum initiatives. If there was anyone who could step in and salvage the situation for her, it was him. Dr. Markham's relief was palpable. "Dean Richardson," she greeted, forcing a strained smile. Perfect timing. The dean's eyes swept the room. He took in the whiteboard, Barron standing at the front, the growing enthusiasm in the students' faces, and Dr. Markham's unnerved expression. He adjusted his tie. "What," he said slowly, "exactly is going on here?" Markham opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, one of the students spoke up first. "Professor Markham challenged Barron to solve a problem," Sarah Chen piped up. "And he did." Dean Richardson's brow furrowed. He turned his gaze to Dr. Markham. She swallowed. "I was simply conducting an academic exercise," she said, her voice suddenly weak. "When Mr. Trump decided to—" "I challenged him," Barron interjected smoothly, stepping forward before she could finish. His voice was calm, measured. The entire class held their breath. Dean Richardson's eyes narrowed. And, Barron said, "I accepted." A long pause. Dean Richardson studied him, then glanced at the students. He wasn't stupid. He could see where the momentum had shifted. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Well, I suppose that settles that," he said. Then, much to Dr. Markham's horror, he turned to Barron. "Mr. Trump, since you clearly have a talent for teaching mathematics, perhaps you'd like to lead a formal review session for the class next week." Dr. Markham's stomach dropped. The students erupted into cheers. And Barron? He just smiled. Not in victory, not in arrogance, but in satisfaction. Because at that moment it was clear to everyone, even the dean, who the real teacher in the room was. The applause had not yet died down when Dean Richardson turned to Dr. Markham. His sharp gaze flickered between her and Barron, weighing the situation carefully. There was no escaping it. The momentum had shifted. The classroom was no longer hers to control, and the students had chosen to rally behind merit, truth, and excellence. Dr. Markham's face remained stiff, but behind her cold stare was a swirling storm of humiliation, fury, and disbelief. She had spent years positioning herself as the intellectual authority in this institution. She had wielded her ideology like a weapon, pushing activism over academics, bias over brilliance. And yet, in a single day, in one unexpected exchange, a quiet young man with an unshakable mind and a relentless devotion to truth had dismantled it all. She had lost. And worse, everyone knew it. Dean Richardson, ever the politician, gave her an out. "Dr. Markham, I believe you have another class soon. Perhaps it would be best if we continue this discussion later." A calculated move. He wasn't about to publicly reprimand her in front of students. That would be bad optics. But she could see the writing on the wall. Her tenure at this university had just become precarious. She had become the story. And it wasn't the one she had written for herself. Dr. Markham cleared her throat, mustering the last shreds of her dignity. "Of course, Dean," she said through gritted teeth. She turned to Barron, who stood unfazed before her. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled resentment, "I trust you'll continue to take your studies seriously." A lesser man might have smirked, reveled in the humiliation she now felt. But Barron Trump was no lesser man. Instead, he met her gaze with composure, wisdom, and something she had never expected. "I always have, Professor," he said simply. And with that, Dr. Markham strode toward the door, her shoulders rigid, her mind racing with the inevitable fallout she would soon face from the administration, the faculty, and, most horrifying of all, the students. The moment the door clicked shut, the energy in the room shifted. A wave of unrestrained excitement surged through the class. Students stood up, clapping, laughing, cheering for Barron like he had just led them to victory in a battle they didn't even realize they were fighting. Sarah Chen practically ran up to him. "Dude," she said, her voice still tinged with disbelief, "that was insane. I mean, we all knew you were smart, but that," she gestured toward the board, "that was next level." Others crowded around, peppering him with questions, not just about the equations, but about his mindset, his approach to learning, his perspective on standing up to authority. Michael Chen, Sarah's twin brother, grinned. "Man, you didn't just prove her wrong, you proved what this class was supposed to be about in the first place." Barron chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone," he said, ever humble, ever composed. "I just wanted to remind everyone that learning should be about truth, not politics." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the room like a movement being born. And then, the moment became something more. The students didn't just congratulate Barron, they asked him to teach them. For months they had sat through Dr. Markham's agenda-driven lectures, forced to grit their teeth through her condescension, feeling stifled, unheard, uninspired. But now they saw what was possible. A class where intellectual curiosity wasn't suppressed, but encouraged. A classroom where questions weren't shut down for being problematic, but welcomed. A learning environment where truth, not ideology, was the foundation. One by one, students began making plans, study sessions, group discussions. A real academic community was forming right before their eyes. And at the center of it all, Barron Trump. Sarah smirked. "You do realize that after today you're basically a legend, right?" Barron just shook his head, amused. "I'm just a student," he said. "Same as all of you." Michael laughed. "Yeah, a student who just outclassed a tenured professor on live video. That footage is everywhere, dude. This isn't just a campus thing. People are talking about this online." And they were. By the time the class had ended, clips of the debate had already gone viral. Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. The world had just witnessed an elite professor's worst nightmare, a student refusing to be silenced, armed with nothing but the truth and a brilliant mind. A hashtag had already begun trending. Teach math, not politics. News outlets had picked up the story. Some tried to spin it, painting Dr. Markham as the victim. Others, however, saw it for what it truly was, a defining moment in the battle for academic integrity. And at the heart of it all, Barron Trump, a young man who had never sought the spotlight, who had never asked for fame, but who had stood up when it mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Barron's name became synonymous with academic excellence. His study groups quickly outgrew their original classroom, forcing the university to assign larger lecture halls for what had become one of the most attended student-led initiatives in years. Students from across departments, across ideologies, across backgrounds, flocked to his sessions, not because of his name, but because of his ideas. He had, without ever intending to, restored a love of learning in a place where it had been lost. And the impact didn't stop there. Other universities took notice. Other students watching the viral videos started questioning their own classrooms, their own professors. Slowly but surely, a movement began. And all because one young man had the courage to challenge the system, not with anger, not with ideology, but with intelligence, respect, and truth. One evening, as Barron packed up his books after another packed study session, Sarah nudged him playfully. "You realize you basically changed the course of this university, right?" Barron just smiled. "I just reminded people what college is supposed to be about," he said. "The rest, that was all of you." As he walked out of the lecture hall, the students applauded him one last time. Not because he was a Trump, not because he had made headlines, but because he had reminded them of something far more important. That knowledge is power, that truth still matters, and that no matter what politics tried to distort it, no matter what agendas tried to corrupt it, real education would always belong to those who sought it. Barron Trump hadn't just won a debate that day. He had reignited the pursuit of knowledge. And that was a victory no one could ever take away. Barron Trump's story is more than just a moment in a university classroom. It's a powerful reminder of the value of intelligence, integrity, and standing firm in the face of bias. In a world where politics often overshadows education, he proved that true knowledge transcends agendas. His courage to challenge a flawed system and his commitment to academic excellence inspired not just his classmates, but students across the nation. This lesson applies to all of us today. Truth matters, merit matters, and standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, matters. If you believe in the importance of real education, free thought, and intellectual courage, then share this inspiring story with others. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we have many more powerful stories to tell. Together, let's keep the pursuit of truth alive. See you in the next video.